Part 1. High School Beginnings. David never really believed in love stories. He always thought they belonged in the realm of movies, cheesy novels, or whispered gossip in the hallways. That was until 9th grade, when Kendall Moore walked into his life. Not in a thunderstorm of fate, but in the quiet, unassuming way that real love often does. They had known of each other since middle school. Their town wasn't big, and both their families lived within a 10-minute drive. Their parents were even casual friends, exchanging warm greetings at school events or neighborhood barbecues. But knowing someone's face is different from really knowing them. For years, David and Kendall had been two satellites orbiting in the same small universe, their paths brushing but never colliding. That changed the year they were both placed in Mrs. Reynolds' English class. Kendall had always been good with words. She loved stories, the kind of person who annotated the margins of her novels and carried a journal everywhere. David, on the other hand, excelled in math and science. English was a battlefield for him, where commas seemed to conspire against him and essays bled red with corrections. So when Mrs. Reynolds assigned a semester-long project that required partners, fate, or perhaps the cunning of a teacher who saw an opportunity, paired David with Kendall. At first, David felt cursed. He imagined long hours of reading poetry he couldn't decipher and writing drafts that never satisfied. But Kendall didn't see it as torture. She saw it as a challenge, and perhaps deep down as an adventure. Their first study session happened at Kendall's house, in a living room scented faintly of vanilla candles. David was nervous, though he couldn't quite explain why. Kendall's younger sister, Lila, had been the one to open the door, a wide-eyed girl with the same honey-brown hair, but a livelier, almost mischievous spark in her eyes. She peeked at David curiously before calling upstairs for her sister. That was the first time he set foot in the Moore household, a place that would eventually feel like a second home. Kendall came down the stairs in a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and her smile, her genuine, easy smile, was what put him at ease. "Ready to suffer through Shakespeare with me?" she teased. That was the beginning. Over the next weeks, study sessions turned into laughter-filled evenings. Kendall had a way of making literature come alive. She read lines with theatrical flair, pausing dramatically before glancing at David, who tried and failed to suppress his laughter. When he stumbled over words, she corrected him with patience rather than scorn. He, in turn, helped her with math homework, showing her tricks to solve equations faster. Their friendship deepened in those small exchanges when she caught him humming along to a song she loved, or when he noticed she doodled stars in the corners of her notes. They discovered that both their families loved Friday night football games, that their parents had once vacationed together years back, and that their fathers shared a peculiar obsession with grilling steaks the right way. By the middle of the semester, their parents had started noticing how often David and Kendall were together, yet no one interfered. There was a quiet, unspoken approval in the way their mothers exchanged knowing smiles, or how their fathers invited the Utter family over for barbecues more frequently. The turning point came one chilly autumn evening. The school had organized a fall dance, one of those events where the gym was transformed with string lights and cheap decorations. Kendall wasn't planning to go. She hated the idea of standing awkwardly in a corner. David wasn't going either. He would have rather stayed home playing video games, but their friends convinced them. David remembered the moment vividly. Kendall walked into the gym wearing a simple navy dress, nothing extravagant, but the way she carried herself made her glow. He suddenly couldn't focus on anyone else. It was as if the room had blurred and the music had softened, leaving only her. They danced that night, awkwardly stumbling, laughing at themselves, but something shifted. In the dim light of the decorated gym, Kendall leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. David's heart hammered so loud, he thought she must hear it. The next day, they both pretended nothing had happened, but neither could forget. It wasn't until winter that David gathered the courage to tell her. They were walking home after a late study session, snow crunching beneath their boots, their breath visible in the frosty air. The world was quiet, as if holding its breath. David's palms were sweaty inside his gloves, but he finally blurted out, "Kendall, I think I like you, more than just a friend." She stopped walking. For a terrifying second, David thought he'd ruined everything. But then she smiled, a shy, radiant smile, and whispered, "I was hoping you'd say that." They stood there in the cold, laughing at how nervous they both had been. David wanted to kiss her then, but he didn't. That came later, after weeks of growing bolder, of learning how to hold hands under the table during class, or sneaking glances when they thought no one was watching. Their relationship blossomed quickly, yet naturally. They weren't the kind of couple that flaunted their love in front of everyone. Instead, theirs was the quiet, steady kind, the kind that felt more like home than fireworks. They studied together, supported each other during exams, and shared small traditions, like splitting a pack of gummy bears during every football game. Both families watched with warmth. Their parents, longtime friends, found themselves becoming even closer. Dinners that had once been occasional turned into weekly gatherings. Kendall's mom often joked that she'd end up setting another plate for David permanently. His parents admired Kendall's kindness, her way of grounding their son without dimming his spark. And then there was Leela, Kendall's younger sister. At the time, she was still just the playful little sibling, hovering at the edges, teasing them occasionally. She would roll her eyes dramatically when David and Kendall sat too close on the couch. But even then, she seemed harmless, a mischievous presence, not a threat. By the time they graduated high school, David and Kendall were inseparable. Their classmates often joked that they were basically married already. The couple didn't mind. They had weathered teenage insecurities, academic stress, and the chaos of growing up, always side by side. It was a love that began not with grand gestures, but with shared homework, laughter over spilled coffee, and late-night conversations about dreams and fears. It was a love that felt unshakable, built on trust, history, and a sense that they had been destined for each other long before they realized it themselves. And so, as they left behind the lockers and classrooms of high school, David and Kendall carried with them not just memories, but the certainty that what they had was real, and that it would last. Part 2, the proposal and the engagement years. College was supposed to be the test, the great divide where most high school sweethearts drifted apart. David and Kendall had heard the warnings from teachers, from friends, even from older cousins who shook their heads knowingly. "It never lasts," they said. "High school love doesn't survive the real world." But David and Kendall were never like everyone else. They chose different colleges. David pursuing engineering at a university an hour away, Ken still staying tethered to one another. David learned independence, managing a heavy workload, navigating new friendships. Kendall found her voice in college, joining the student paper, tutoring freshmen in writing, and dreaming of becoming a teacher. And through it all, they had each other. Chuck, David learned independence, managing a heavy workload, navigating new friendships, tutoring freshmen in writing. They weren't kids playing at romance anymore. They were partners, equals, best friends who had weathered the storms of adolescence and young adulthood. David had been planning his proposal for months. He wanted it to be perfect, not flashy, not something ripped from a viral video online, but something true to them. So on a crisp autumn evening, 2 years after college, he asked Kendall to meet him at the small park where they had once walked home together during high school. It was the same path where, years ago, he had nervously confessed his feelings in the falling snow. Now he waited under the golden canopy of trees, the leaves crunching beneath his shoes as his heart pounded with anticipation. When Kendall arrived, bundled in her favorite scarf, David smiled nervously. They walked together for a while, reminiscing about their high school days, laughing about awkward dances and forgotten homework. Then, at the exact spot where he had once blurted out his teenage confession, David stopped. "Kendall," he said softly, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I told you I liked you here all those years ago. Tonight, I want to tell you something else. I don't just like you, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Kendall was silent, stunned. Then her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Yes, David, of course yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the world seemed to pause around them. The rustling of leaves, the cool autumn air, the faint glow of the setting sun, it all blurred into the background of their perfect moment. The engagement was celebrated not only by them, but by their families. Both sets of parents were ecstatic, hosting a joint dinner where laughter filled the room and toasts were made to the future. Their fathers, already like brothers, clinked glasses of wine, while their mothers hugged Kendall tightly as if she had always been their daughter. Lila, Kendall's younger sister, was among the loudest cheerleaders. She squealed when she saw the ring, hugging her sister and teasing David about finally making it official. At that time, there was no shadow, no hint of the storm that would one day come. Lila was simply the little sister, excited, supportive, playful. The 2 years of engagement were some of the happiest of Kendall's life. Planning the wedding was stressful at times, as it always is, but David was there every step of the way. They toured venues together, tasted cakes, debated guest lists. They compromised, they laughed through disagreements, and in the end, they built the day they had always dreamed of. Their wedding was held on a warm summer afternoon in the garden of a historic estate just outside town. White roses lined the aisle, and fairy lights twinkled as the sun dipped low. Kendall walked toward David in a gown that shimmered like starlight, her smile radiant, her eyes locked on his. When they exchanged vows, their voices trembled with emotion. David promised to love her fiercely, to stand beside her through every season. Kendall vowed to be his partner, his confidant, his home. When they kissed, cheers erupted from the crowd, and both families celebrated as if it were their own victory. That night, under a canopy of stars, David and Kendall danced as husband and wife for the first time. It wasn't a glamorous waltz or a rehearsed routine, just two people swaying to the music, lost in each other's arms. For everyone watching, it was obvious. Theirs was a love that had endured, a love built to last. The first months of marriage were blissful. They moved into a modest house not far from both families. A cozy 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a backyard where they dreamed of planting a garden. They filled the space with laughter, late-night conversations, and the smell of Kendall's baking experiments. Sundays became a tradition of big family dinners, sometimes at their house, sometimes at Kendall's parents', sometimes at David's. Their families were more intertwined than ever, sharing holidays, vacations, and milestones as one extended unit. David's career in engineering was taking off, while Kendall began teaching at a local high school, inspiring students with her love of literature. They were building a life together, brick by brick, day by day. It seemed perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. Looking back, Kendall would later realize that perfection can sometimes mask the smallest cracks, the ones invisible until they widen into fractures. But in those first years, she noticed nothing. She only saw the man she had loved since 9th grade, her partner, her husband, her future. And David, for all appearances, seemed equally devoted. He brought her flowers on Fridays, kissed her forehead before leaving for work, and held her hand at family gatherings. They were the golden couple, admired by everyone who knew them. The engagement years, and even the first years of their marriage, would one day feel to Kendall like a dream, a shining chapter of her life untouched by the darkness to come. For now, she believed they were unshakable, untouchable. She had no idea how wrong she was. Part 3: Married Life and the First Shadows of Doubt. For the first 2 years, married life was everything Kendall had ever dreamed it would be. She and David built routines together, small rituals that made their house feel like a home. Saturday mornings meant pancakes in the kitchen, with David flipping them clumsily while Kendall laughed at his creative shapes. Sunday evenings meant sprawling on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched old movies. Their friends admired them. They were the couple others measured themselves against, the ones who seemed to balance work, family, and love effortlessly. David excelled at his job, already earning recognition from his firm. Kendall, now a literature teacher at the local high school, was beloved by her students. They were partners in every sense, supporting each other's ambitions while sharing the same vision for the future. Children were part of that vision. They spoke about it often, late at night when the world was quiet. "One day," David would say, tracing circles on Kendall's hand, "we'll fill this house with little footsteps." Kendall would smile, imagining their children inheriting David's sharp mind and, hopefully, her patience. They weren't in a rush, they had time. Or so she believed. Yet perfection has a way of lulling people into blindness. The first shadow came not with thunder, but as a whisper, so faint Kendall almost ignored it. It was a necklace, delicate silver with a small star-shaped pendant. She found it one evening in the glove compartment of David's car while searching for a charger. "Who's this for?" she asked casually when he came home. David didn't hesitate. "Oh, that? For you, of course. I was saving it for your birthday." Kendall blinked. Her birthday was months away. But she laughed it off, hugged him, and thanked him for being thoughtful. Still, when she tried it on later, something in her stomach twisted. The necklace wasn't her style. David knew her taste well. Classic pieces, understated elegance. This one felt different, playful, almost girlish. She didn't dwell on it. After all, why would she? David was her husband, the man she had trusted since she was 15. The second shadow came a few weeks later at a family dinner. Kendall noticed the way David laughed at something Lila said. Her younger sister, now in her early 20s, was vibrant and charismatic, the kind of person who could light up a room. She teased everyone mercilessly, including David. That night, as everyone gathered around the table, Kendall caught a fleeting glance. David looking at Lila with a softness that didn't sit right. It was gone in an instant, replaced with the usual warmth he showed everyone. But it lingered in Kendall's mind. She pushed it away. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's just family, nothing more." But shadows, once noticed, are hard to unsee. Small things began piling up. Text messages David brushed off quickly when Kendall entered the room. Occasional late nights at work he hadn't mentioned earlier. A faint trace of perfume she didn't recognize on his jacket. Sweet, floral, not the scent she wore. Still, Kendall's trust ran deep. She didn't want to be the jealous wife, didn't want to accuse the man she had built her life with over scraps of suspicion. So she silenced her doubts, convincing herself that love meant faith, not paranoia. And yet, the unease grew. One evening, Kendall found herself alone in their bedroom, scrolling absent-mindedly through old photos on her laptop. She stopped at a picture from their wedding, a candid shot of David laughing with Lila on the dance floor. Kendall stared at the image, noticing how close they stood, how Lila's hand lingered on his arm. She had never thought twice about it before. Now, with the seed of doubt planted, it seemed too intimate. Her chest tightened. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "Don't create problems that aren't there." But once suspicion takes root, it spreads like ivy, creeping into every corner of the mind. The breaking point of Kendall's peace came on an ordinary Tuesday. She was folding laundry when she noticed a faint lipstick stain on the collar of David's shirt. Not her shade, not even close. When she asked him about it, David laughed. "Seriously, Kendall, it's probably from when I hugged your mom goodbye last weekend. She was wearing lipstick." Kendall wanted to believe him. She really did. But the unease was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, demanding attention. That night, as David slept soundly beside her, Kendall lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Questions spun in her mind. Was she losing him? Was he hiding something? The thought of betrayal seemed impossible. Yet the evidence, the necklace, the perfume, the glances, the lipstick, was mounting. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. Her intuition, the same instinct that had guided her as a teacher, as a sister, as a daughter, screamed that something was wrong. But she couldn't yet see the whole truth. Not yet. The cruelest part? Kendall had no idea that the very person she trusted most in the world, her sister, was the one standing on the other side of the shadows. For now, she carried the weight of doubt silently, clinging to the hope that she was mistaken, that her marriage was as strong as she had always believed. She told herself love could withstand anything, but deep down, a chill had settled in her heart, one she could no longer ignore. And soon, that chill would shatter everything she thought she knew. Part 4. Discovering the betrayal. The human heart has a way of sensing truths long before the mind can bear to face them. For weeks, Kendall lived in a state of quiet torment, half convinced she was imagining things, half certain that her entire world was beginning to fracture. She told no one, not her parents, not her closest friends, not even David. To speak the suspicion aloud would make it real, and she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she carried the weight alone, a silent war raging inside her. But the pieces of the puzzle kept falling into place, whether she wanted them to or not. It began with the perfume. One evening, Kendall stopped by her parents' house unannounced. Leela was there, lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Kendall hugged her sister absent-mindedly and froze. The scent, sweet, floral, unmistakable. The same perfume she had caught on David's jacket weeks before. Her stomach clenched. She wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, but the thought gnawed at her. Later that night, when David returned home late from work, Kendall leaned close under the pretense of kissing him hello. The same perfume clung faintly to his shirt. Her heart skipped, then sank. The next clue came disguised as nothing at all. Kendall was in the kitchen one Saturday morning, making coffee, when she heard laughter in the backyard. She peeked through the window and saw David helping Lila with something on her car. They were standing too close, laughing too easily. David's hand brushed against Lila's shoulder as he leaned over to inspect the engine. It could have been innocent. It should have been innocent. But when Kendall called out to them, David jumped back as if burned. That was when the first spark of real fear struck her. And then came the messages. David had left his phone charging on the nightstand one evening while he showered. Kendall never went through his things. She hated the idea of invading his privacy. But that night, when the screen lit up with a notification, her eyes betrayed her. It wasn't a name, just an initial, L, but the message beneath it made her blood run cold. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Her hands shook. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She stared at the message until the words blurred, until her entire body felt numb. When David returned, humming as he toweled his hair, Kendall forced a smile and pretended nothing was wrong. But inside, something had shattered. Denial was no longer possible. Over the next days, Kendall began noticing details she had missed before. Lila's sudden secrecy, stepping out of the room to answer texts, avoiding eye contact at family dinners. David's frequent excuses for working late. His phone always face down on the table. The way he grew irritable when she asked simple questions. The world around her felt surreal, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Finally, the truth struck in a way that left no room for doubt. Kendall had stayed late at school one evening, grading essays. On her way home, she decided to stop by her parents' house. It was unplanned, a whim. She pulled into the driveway, surprised to see David's car parked outside. Her heart thudded painfully. Maybe he was there to pick her up. Maybe he was visiting her parents. She clung to excuses, fragile lifelines of hope. But when she stepped quietly into the house, she heard it. Laughter, whispered voices, the sound of Leela's giggle echoing down the hallway. Kendall froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave before she saw. But something stronger pulled her forward. She walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, until she reached the door of Leela's bedroom, slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw them. David, her husband, sitting on the edge of Leela's bed, his hand on her thigh, his lips curved in a smile Kendall had once believed belonged only to her. Leela leaned into him, their intimacy undeniable, their betrayal complete. The world stopped. Kendall felt as if the floor had vanished beneath her. Her chest constricted, her breath caught, her vision blurred with tears she couldn't yet release. A sound escaped her throat, a broken, involuntary gasp. Both David and Leela jerked their heads toward the door, their faces drained of color. "Kendall," David began, rising quickly, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as though underwater. Leela's eyes widened with horror, guilt, and something else, fear. Kendall couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The betrayal was too vast, too unfathomable. This was her husband. This was her sister. The two people she trusted most in the world, and they had been lying to her, deceiving her, tearing apart the very foundation of her life. Finally, words forced their way out of her trembling lips. "How could you?" Her voice cracked, sharp and raw. "How could you do this to me, both of you?" Neither had an answer. David stammered, reaching for her, but she recoiled as if his touch were poison. Leela began to cry, but Kendall couldn't bear to look at her. The sight of her sister, her own blood, wrapped in this betrayal was unbearable. Kendall turned and fled the house, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with sobs she could no longer contain. That night, alone in her car, she let herself break. She screamed into the silence, pounded her fists against the steering wheel, wept until her throat was raw. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a theft of her past, her future, her trust. Her mind replayed every moment, every clue she had ignored. The necklace, the perfume, the glances, the message. It had all been there, whispering to her, and she had chosen not to listen. Now, the whispers had become a roar she couldn't escape. In the days that followed, Kendall told her parents. The shock on their faces mirrored her own anguish. Her mother wept openly, clutching Kendall, as if to shield her from the pain. Her father's face hardened with rage, his silence more terrifying than any outburst. David tried to explain, to beg forgiveness, but his words fell on deaf ears. Leela, too, tried to reach out, sobbing apologies, but Kendall refused to answer her calls. The betrayal had torn not only Kendall's marriage apart, but the bond between two families that had once been inseparable. And yet, in the wreckage, Kendall felt something stir inside her, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She would not let this betrayal define her. She would not let their choices destroy her. The storm had come, but she was still standing. Part 5. The Unraveling Truth. The night Kendall finally allowed herself to believe what her heart already feared was one she would never forget. It had been an ordinary evening. Dinner with her parents, her sister at the table, David beside her as always. Laughter filled the room, yet Kendall felt strangely detached, as though she were watching the scene from a distance. When her sister excused herself to take a phone call, Kendall noticed David's eyes follow her a moment too long. It was not the first time. That was when Kendall's mind began to connect the fragments. The soft familiarity in the way her sister said David's name, the subtle pauses in conversations when she entered a room, the text messages David would quickly swipe away when she approached. Alone, each moment could have been dismissed as nothing. Together, They formed a chilling mosaic. Later that week, Kendall noticed a scarf of her sister's left in the back seat of their car, one her sister never wore around anyone else. It smelled faintly of David's cologne. Kendall froze, her breath caught in her chest. She wanted to scream, but silence pressed against her lungs. She placed the scarf back where she found it, as if pretending ignorance could make it untrue. But the dam had broken. Once her mind allowed the possibility, she began to see the truth everywhere. David returning home late, his excuses flimsy. The slip of her sister's hand brushing against his in a way that felt too natural. An offhand comment her sister once made about how no one will ever love you like David does. Strange at the time, sinister now. The final confirmation came one rainy Saturday. Kendall had left her book in David's study and went to retrieve it. She never intended to invade his privacy, but the phone buzzed on the desk, lighting up with her sister's name. Against every instinct, she opened it. What she saw shattered her. Messages, hundreds of them. Words of affection, secrets, plans. Her husband's devotion, not to her, but to the one person in the world who should have been untouchable. Kendall dropped the phone. Her hands trembled violently, her vision blurred with tears. She fell to the floor, knees hitting the hardwood with a thud she barely felt. For minutes, maybe hours, she stayed there, the betrayal pressing down on her until she thought her chest might collapse. It wasn't only her marriage that had been broken. It was her trust, her family, her very sense of self. The man she had loved since 9th grade, the sister she had grown up protecting. Together, they had conspired to destroy her. When she confronted David, he didn't deny it. His silence was worse than any shouted confession. Her sister's face, when cornered, was pale and unrepentant. The world Kendall had built, piece by piece, over 10 years, came crashing down in a single breath. Part 6. The Shockwave in the Families. The day the truth came out did not feel real to Kendall. It was like stepping into a nightmare in which every voice sounded distorted, every color too sharp, every breath heavy with disbelief. But there was no waking from it. When she finally told her parents, her mother clutched the edge of the kitchen counter as if the weight of the words might topple her. "David and your sister?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Her father, usually the stoic center of their family, looked as though he had been physically struck. His hands, weathered and strong, shook as he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, unable to stand beneath the enormity of what he just heard. For a long time, silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. Kendall's younger sister had always been the family's golden child, bubbly, full of life, adored by everyone. David had been welcomed into their lives as though he were blood, a second son to her parents, a trusted presence who joined Sunday dinners and holiday traditions without question. Together, the two families had shared vacations, barbecues, birthdays. They weren't just in-laws, they were intertwined, two branches of the same tree. And now, that tree had been split down the middle by betrayal. When the truth reached David's parents, the response was no less devastating. His mother, a woman who had always embraced Kendall as her own daughter, wept openly, hands pressed to her face. His father, who had once praised David for being steadfast and honorable, shouted so loudly the neighbors could hear through the open windows. "You've disgraced us all," his father roared. "Your wife trusted you. We trusted you. And with her sister, her own blood, have you lost every shred of decency?" David stood in silence, head bowed. No words that could bridge the abyss he had created. Kendall's sister, cornered by the collapsing walls of both families, tried to defend herself at first. "It just happened," she insisted, eyes wet with tears, but her voice brittle. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." But the excuses only deepened the wounds. "It didn't just happen," Kendall spat, her pain turning her voice into a blade. "You made choices. Every single text, every meeting, every lie. You chose this." Her mother's sobs filled the room. Her father turned his face away, unable to even look at the daughter he had once held as his pride and joy. The betrayal reverberated like an earthquake. Family friends, once admiring of the perfect couple and the close-knit families, began to murmur. Neighbors cast sympathetic glances at Kendall, while others whispered in shock at the scandal unraveling in plain view. The perfect love story that had begun in the halls of a high school was now gossip on the lips of an entire community. Kendall's heart ached most not for the whispers, but for the shattering of bonds she had believed unbreakable. She had lost not only her husband, but her sister, the girl who once shared secrets under the covers, who had been her companion through childhood storms, the girl she had defended in playground quarrels, the one she had held on the night of her first heartbreak. That sister was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. And David, the boy who had walked her home after class, who had held her hand under the bleachers, who had promised forever, he too was a stranger. Kendall's father demanded answers one evening when both families gathered in a storm of raised voices and tear-streaked faces. "How long?" he demanded, eyes narrowing at David. David hesitated, but hesitation itself was an answer. "Too long," Kendall whispered before he could speak. She had read enough messages to know the betrayal wasn't a fleeting mistake. It was deliberate, sustained. Her father's face hardened, his grief transmuting into fury. "Get out," he growled at David. "You're not welcome here anymore." Kendall's mother, sobbing, looked at her younger daughter and shook her head as if denial might still erase the truth. "How could you? She is your sister, your own sister." There was no reply, only silence thick enough to drown in. From that day forward, the families fractured. Kendall's parents refused to see their younger daughter. The once bright, warm bond between sisters turned into a cold chasm. David's parents, humiliated and enraged, cut ties with their son, ashamed of the scandal he had brought upon them. He had not only destroyed his marriage, but also his relationship with his parents, who could not bear the disgrace. Kendall, though shattered, found unexpected strength in her pain. The betrayal had carved into her soul, but from that wound rose a clarity she had never known before. She realized she was not defined by David's mistakes, nor by her sister's weakness. She was defined by her resilience. Friends gathered around her, offering shoulders to cry on, voices to remind her of her worth. Her parents, despite their grief, poured their love into her, determined to help her heal. But David and Kendall's sister found only isolation. Once embraced, now shunned, they became pariahs in the very community that had once celebrated their closeness. Whispers followed them wherever they went, murmurs of disgust, pity, condemnation. For Kendall, justice was not revenge. It was survival. It was choosing to walk forward without them. Even as the weight of betrayal dragged at her heels, the shockwave had leveled everything she once held sacred. But in the rubble, she began to see something else, the possibility of rebuilding, not with David, not with her sister, but with herself. Part 7, the final chapter. The divorce came swiftly, but not painlessly. In the courtroom, Kendall sat across from David for the last time as husband and wife. His face was thinner than she remembered, drawn with sleepless nights and regret. Once, she might have reached for his hand, tried to ease his burden. Now, she felt only a cold detachment, as though the man before her was a stranger wearing David's features. The judge's voice was steady, impartial, but every sentence felt like the closing of a door, division of assets, termination of marital obligations, the formal dissolution of a union that had once been the centerpiece of their lives. Kendall's heart clenched as the gavel struck wood, not from longing, but from the sheer finality of it. Their marriage was over. When she left the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp, the leaves blazing in shades of red and gold. She drew in a deep breath, the first that felt truly her own in months. She was free, not unscarred, but free. For David and Kendall's sister, however, freedom did not feel like liberation. It felt like exile. David's parents, humiliated beyond words, cut him off completely. "You are no son of mine," his father declared during their last confrontation. His mother, though softer in her grief, could not look at him without tears. Years of trust and love had evaporated. The home that once welcomed him with warmth now turned him away with silence. Kendall's sister faced an equally harsh fate. Their parents, who had once adored her, no longer took her calls. Family gatherings continued without her. Birthdays passed unacknowledged. Her mother's voice, when it did reach her, was cold and clipped, stripped of maternal warmth. "You've destroyed us," she said simply. Together, David and Kendall's sister found themselves isolated. At first, perhaps they believed their bond could withstand the storm. But betrayal does not build a foundation, it corrodes it. Every whispered accusation from the outside world seeped into their relationship, poisoning whatever fragile connection they had forged. They fought constantly, about money, about blame, about the lingering presence of Kendall in their lives. David grew resentful, bitter at the collapse of his reputation, at the cold shoulders from neighbors who once admired him. Kendall's sister, racked with guilt she tried to mask with anger, accused him of ruining her life. They were two broken people clinging to each other, not out of love, but out of desperation. It was a miserable union, and everyone around them knew it. For Kendall, healing was not instant. Nights still came with tears, and some mornings she woke with the hollow ache of absence. But slowly, she began to reclaim herself. She returned to the hobbies she had once set aside: painting, running, reading late into the night. She surrounded herself with friends who reminded her of her strength, who laughed with her until her ribs hurt, who carried her when the weight grew too heavy. One evening, as she painted by the window, her mother came to sit beside her. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age," her mother said softly, watching the brush strokes take form. "You've survived something that would have broken many, and you're still standing." Kendall smiled faintly. "Sometimes I don't feel strong." "That's the trick," her mother replied. "Strength isn't about feeling unbreakable. It's about choosing to keep going even when you feel like pieces." Those words stayed with Kendall. As months turned into a year, she noticed something remarkable. She was no longer defined by the betrayal. She was not simply the woman whose husband cheated with her sister. She was Kendall, daughter, friend, artist, survivor. And in time, she began to believe in love again. Not the reckless, youthful love that had once bound her to David, but something gentler, wiser. She met someone new, not in a whirlwind of passion, but in quiet moments of shared laughter. In conversations that stretched into the night, in the steady presence of someone who valued honesty above all. She did not rush. She let trust grow like roots, deep and unshakable. With him, she discovered that love did not have to hurt, that it could be kind, patient, and healing. Meanwhile, David and her sister's story unraveled further. Within 2 years, their fragile relationship collapsed under the weight of resentment and guilt. They separated bitterly, each blaming the other for the ruin of their lives. Neither found peace. David drifted from job to job, haunted by the wreckage of his choices. His once bright future was a shadow, his reputation permanently stained. Friends kept their distance. Opportunities dried up. His name, once spoken with admiration, became a cautionary tale. Kendall's sister, estranged from her family and community, struggled with loneliness she could not escape. The warmth of belonging was gone, replaced by the cold echo of isolation. She reached out occasionally, desperate to repair what she had destroyed, but Kendall never answered. Forgiveness might come one day, but reconciliation never would. They had gambled everything for a fleeting passion, and in the end, they lost it all. For Kendall, however, the ending was not one of loss, but of rebirth. On the second anniversary of her divorce, she hosted a small gathering at her home. Just her parents, a few close friends, and the man who now stood by her side. Laughter filled the rooms once more, genuine and unclouded. Her father raised a glass in her honor, his eyes shining with pride. To Kendall, he said, for reminding us that even in the darkest storms, the sun always finds a way back. Everyone cheered, glasses clinking, and Kendall felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had survived the storm. She had rebuilt her life, and she was happy, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had found within herself. As the night drew on, she stepped outside to breathe in the cool evening air. The stars stretched endlessly above her, brilliant and unyielding. For the first time in a long time, Kendall felt at peace. Her story had not ended in betrayal. It had ended in freedom, in strength, in a life reclaimed. And though David and her sister had written themselves into her past with ink too dark to erase, Kendall knew they had no place in her future. Her future was hers alone, and it gleamed brighter than ever.